If tonight feels heavy, and the quiet still won't hold you, come with me. You're not alone in the sleepless hours. Many of us drift through them, quietly, searching for stories soft enough to rest inside. This is Boring History Nights, where sleep finds you in forgotten places and voices that barely rise above a whisper. Let the lights soften, let the hours drift, and if something in this story speaks to you, feel free to leave a word behind in the comments. I do read them, even in the silence. Now let the dark stay dark. Let whatever follows arrive slowly, like it's always been here. You don't have to keep up. Just listen. You walk slowly, not because anyone's watching, but because the place demands it. The walls are older than stories. They've held breath longer than most people have held faith. Around you, everything echoes like it's still deciding whether or not to speak. The stone isn't cold because of the weather. It's cold because it's been touched by too many hands who never touched freedom. This is a convent, yes, but not the kind sung about in carols or painted in illuminated margins. This one is tired. Its windows are too high to look through. Its gates too old to creak. Silence doesn't feel holy here. It feels rehearsed. You've barely stepped in, and already you can tell whatever peace lives in these stones. It has to compete with something underneath, something pressing up from below, not loud but heavy like a breath that never exhaled. You're not one of them, not yet. But you've seen the look, the one in their eyes, when they kneel, but don't close their lids. When they whisper prayers meant more for the rafters than for God. You've heard it too. At meals, the way no one mentions the thud beneath the table, the soft rumble that isn't the wind. And you've wondered, as they pass their bread and bow their heads, whether they're praying for salvation or for the wall not to crack again. The hidden lives of medieval nuns weren't always cloistered by choice. For some, the convent was a hiding place from marriage, from sin, from families who saw them as debt repaid. For others, it was simply the only door that ever opened. But once inside, it didn't take long to realize that vows didn't always seal souls. Sometimes, they just sealed secrets. You find yourself drawn to the outer wall, not the chapel. That part feels too polished, too watched. No, it's the corridor beside the bread ovens, near where the cloaks hang damp in the winter. There's something about it, a shift in the air, a faint scent of earth that doesn't belong to stone. You place your hand on the wall, half thinking it foolish, half hoping it answers. And it does. Not in words, not in visions, but in the tiniest shift of vibration that isn't wind, isn't draft, isn't anything your mind wants to name out loud. The stone isn't solid. Not here. It's hollow, or layered, or hiding something that resents being hidden. You don't tell anyone, not yet, because here, silence is currency, and you're not sure you've earned enough to spend any yet. There's a saying the older sisters whisper when the novices fall asleep. The floor remembers. You thought it meant the sound of footsteps, the ritual of prayer, but now you wonder if they meant something else, something buried. The convent was built in the 12th century, though no one's quite sure what came before it. Some say there was a Roman road beneath. Others claim a pagan altar was buried to purify the ground. Either way, the ground has never felt settled. It's not just superstition. Chronicles speak of repairs made to lower chambers that no longer exist, of sisters reassigned after discovering structural instabilities. There are drawings, architectural sketches, with entire wings erased in charcoal, replaced by nothing but question marks. One marginal note, in a forgotten cartulary, reads, "Do not reopen the breadroom floor." You dream that night, or maybe you don't. Maybe it's just the memory of the stone pressing into your back that replays itself. In the dream, you're crawling. The tunnel isn't wide, but it holds light somehow, not from torches, but from breath the warmth of bodies who've gone before you. Their fear glows faintly on the walls. You wake with your veil twisted and your hand pressed to the stone beside your bed. And when the bell rings for morning psalms, you move more slowly than the others, not from sleep, but from a strange ache that runs behind your spine, like you've carried something too long without knowing its shape. Some say the tunnels were for safety escape routes in times of siege. Others claim they were for penance, paths to hidden cells where nuns could atone without light. But the story you begin to hear, whispered behind linen veils and between clutched hands, is quieter than either of those. It's not about escape or punishment. It's about choice. Because not every woman who came here came broken. Some came with fire still in their lungs. And when the rules asked that they smother it in incense and silence, they didn't. Not completely. They let it burn downward, into the walls, into the dirt. You think of Sister Morelia, the one who doesn't speak, unless asked directly, but whose eyes follow every stone like they're reading a forgotten story. She never kneels on the third tile from the left in the south transept. You've noticed, and now that seems to matter. There's something sacred about secrets that were never meant to be buried. They grow strange roots. They become myths, and then, slowly, they rot into facts again. You begin to count the steps between certain doors. You notice where the air runs warmer, where the scent of lavender turns to loam. You drop a pebble in a corner and hear it bounce twice, once on stone, and once on something else, something waiting. And yet, despite all this, you never once speak aloud what you know, because the hidden lives of medieval nuns weren't just about what they were forced to hide, but about what they learned to carry so quietly. Even truth forgot its shape. There are nights when silence deepens, not by absence, but by weight, as though the air itself thickens in refusal, folding itself around sound so tightly that even footsteps are muffled beneath it. That night, the night the lantern vanished, was one of those. It didn't announce itself with thunder or wind. It came in gently like a robe drawn too tightly, like breath caught halfway, like a bell that should have rung but didn't. And the sisters, each in their own cells, each wrapped in their own rituals, would later remember that the usual creaks and rustles of the building had withdrawn, leaving something too still in their place. You didn't hear the absence at first. You felt it. That subtle shift when the rhythm of a place you thought you knew no longer matches the rhythm of your own thoughts. When the bricks seem to press in rather than hold out the night. When the torch by the northern wall flickers once and then doesn't return. One less flame shouldn't matter, but somehow it does. Somehow it is everything. You walk the cloister in near darkness, the waxy scent of extinguished flame hanging like a question. The wind hasn't changed. No one opened a door, but something has moved, or been moved, and you're not the only one who notices. Sister Adele, who sweeps with a precision that borders on prayer, pauses near the arch where the lantern once hung. Her broom stills. Her eyes narrow, not in fear, but in recognition, the kind that belongs not to a moment, but to memory. She doesn't speak. No one does. Not yet. The hidden lives of medieval nuns were often described in the language of devotion, cloistered piety, quiet service, eternal contemplation. But within the walls, between the layers of scripture and the rituals of obedience, there were other lives being lived, lives stitched from glances, hidden messages tucked in prayer books, footsteps mapped in stone. And sometimes, when history paused just long enough, those lives glimmered faintly, like the missing lantern, leaving behind not just a shadow, but a shape that shouldn't be there. There had been talk, of course, before this, always talk, of a passage beneath the southern walk, of sounds in the chapel long after compline, of linen robes found damp in the morning, as though someone had walked through something older than the walls. And no matter how often the abbess dismissed such things as nonsense, as metaphor for temptation, or trial, or the devil's whisper, those who had lived longest within the stone knew better than to speak too quickly or disbelieve too fully. Because when the same lantern disappears twice in a year and is returned neither time, the absence becomes more than metaphor. It becomes map. You find yourself moving differently the next day, not out of fear, but out of alignment, as though your body now understands something your mind has not yet put into words. You avoid that corner without trying to. You glance toward the wall before meals, waiting for a flicker that doesn't come. You begin to wonder not just who took it, but why no one ever looks for it. There's a pattern to what is ignored here. Some prayers are recited more fervently when certain bells don't ring. Some names are whispered more gently in the infirmary when the walls seem thinner. And there are sisters who sing louder in the morning, not for joy, but to cover the hollow note left in the night. You overhear things, not by design, simply by being quiet at the right moments, a skill that life here sharpens until it's sharper than suspicion. One voice says the lantern fell and shattered, though no glass was found. Another insists it was removed for cleaning, though no one saw who took it. And a third, barely audible behind the sacristy door, says only, "It always begins again with light." There are stories passed only between novices, not because the older sisters deny them, but because those who've stayed long enough know that some stories become truer if never confirmed. They say that once, during a siege long forgotten by the world outside, 3 sisters dug for 3 nights to bring water into the convent. They didn't find water. They found air cold and moving, a gap in the foundation, a breath the earth was holding. And when they returned, pale and shivering, they said nothing, but none of them ever looked at the bread room the same way again. The hidden lives of medieval nuns weren't built only on faith. They were built on awareness of moods, of patterns, of what shifts when it shouldn't. And when a lantern goes missing, it's not the light they mourn, it's what it used to reveal. You find your steps bringing you back to that archway, days later, when the light is softest and least watched. The dust beneath the wall hasn't been swept, a detail that would normally earn a rebuke, but here is allowed to settle. There's something about the silence there that hums differently, not louder, but older. You kneel not in prayer, but in presence, letting the hush shape itself around you. And as you lower your hand to the floor, fingers brushing the worn edge of stone, you feel it again. That strange, subtle pulse, a kind of echo that doesn't come from the air, but from memory embedded in the mortar. A week later, during midnight reading, the abbess skips an entire passage from the Rule of Benedict, one that speaks of obedience in the dark. No one corrects her. No one even blinks. But something in the room tightens, a thread drawn a little too taut. Later, as you return to your cell, a corner of a parchment slips from beneath your cot. Not yours, not addressed, but written in a hand familiar in its restraint. One line only. The light is gone, but the path remains. You stare at it for a long time, long past the bells, long past the rustling hush that signals sleep. And though your eyes grow heavy, the quiet within you has only just begun to widen. In the morning, Sister Adele sweeps the arch again, still careful, still silent, but now with one less glance over her shoulder. The lantern is never replaced. And yet, somehow, the corridor seems lit, not with flame, not with sunlight, but with something older than either, something remembered. There is something quietly sacred about the scent of baking bread, the way it clings to the damp stone corridors like a second skin, the way it soaks into woolen veils and sleeves, the way even silence itself seems to warm beside it. It is no wonder, then, that the bread room holds a special kind of gravity within the convent, a place where the ritual of nourishment meets the unspoken ache of hunger, not the hunger of flesh alone, but of longing for softness, for ritual, for something that rises instead of collapses. You pass the threshold like always, shoulders lowered by habit more than thought, your eyes flicking briefly to the ceiling as if expecting it to sag under the weight of memory. The heat from the ovens presses softly against your face, curling around your cheekbones with the same gentleness as a whispered blessing. The stones beneath your feet are worn smooth by centuries of movement, not by haste. Never haste, but by the slow repetition of tasks performed not out of joy or even duty, but inevitability. This morning, however, the room feels different. The scent is there, but subdued, as if the loaves themselves have chosen to rise less fully, as though whatever lives in the yeast has begun to retreat. The sisters move quietly, not reverent, but restrained. The dough is handled with care, but not affection. There's a tightness behind every gesture, a stiffness in every glance, as if something else is rising here, to something that cannot be shaped or baked or softened by heat. You kneel to help Sister Mirelle lift the wooden paddle from the corner, and that's when you feel it, the change beneath your knees, the faint shift in air that cannot be traced to breeze or breath. It is not dramatic, not cinematic, just the subtlest suggestion that the floor, so solid and familiar, is not as monastic as it pretends to be. She notices your pause, but says nothing, only looks at you with eyes that have seen more than they admit, and passes the paddle into your hands without adjusting your grip. There is a mutual understanding here, one that has little to do with flour or heat. You both carry on, shaping loaves, stoking embers, whispering the prayer that blesses the rising. But your thoughts remain rooted beneath the room, where no prayer has yet been uttered. Later, alone, you return. The ovens are cooled. The loaves have been carried away in linen-lined baskets. No footsteps echo, no breath sounds, just the hush, thick, unbroken, expectant. You kneel again in the same place, palms pressing gently into the tiles. It takes a moment before you feel it again, the imperceptible draft against your knuckles, the way warmth escapes downward, as if some chamber below were sighing through cracks too narrow to see. You move your hand slightly and press your ear to the stone, half aware of how absurd the action would appear if witnessed, and yet compelled all the same. There it is, the faintest hush, not of wind, not of animals, but of something deeper, a stillness that hums not because it is full, but because it is holding back. The hidden lives of medieval nuns were not lived entirely above ground. In these walls so devoted, so neatly arranged, there existed other spaces, spaces not recorded in maps or scribbled in margins, spaces known only by the shape of cold tiles, by the way dust gathered differently along one seam, or by the sound of loaves cooling too quickly in the middle of the night. It is said that some convents had undercrofts for storing grain, for preserving wine, for locking away worldly temptation in barrels and crates. But this is not that. This isn't storage. This is refusal. Refusal to forget. Refusal to obey. Refusal to stay still when all else demanded stillness. You begin noticing things you hadn't before. A crack along the base of the northern oven, thin as a thread but unnaturally straight. A patch of floor where the grout seems newer than the surrounding stone. the peculiar habit of Sister Anais, who always stands near the door, never fully entering the room, and the smallest of details, the way no one ever bakes alone, though no rule states such a requirement. You wonder when it began, not the tunnel itself, but the decision to dig. Was it desperation? Hope, the slow erosion of belief? Or something gentler, the quiet rebellion of hands that had been told too many times what they could and could not touch? No one speaks of digging. They speak of prayer, of patience, of divine obedience. But behind those words lies a deeper rhythm, one that beats beneath the tiles like a second heart. A rhythm made not of chant or liturgy, but of fingernails broken on stone, of knees bruised by tunnel walls, of breath held and released in inches of darkness. It was not just escape they carved, it was shape. A shape for the grief they weren't allowed to express, a shape for the questions they were told not to ask. The tunnel, if it truly exists, is not a corridor. It is a confession with no listener, a sentence never ended, a psalm that forgot its key. And still, no one speaks of it. Sister Mirelle, when she passes you a fresh cloth for the next baking, places it gently in your hand with a grip too firm to be casual. Her fingers linger half a second too long. Her eyes do not meet yours, but her silence is loud. It says, I know that you know, and that's all we're allowed to say. That night, your dreams are filled with flour, not floating gently, but clumping thickly in the corners of your mind, coating the edge of each memory. You see hands, many, calloused, trembling, moving in unison along a wall. You hear a prayer you've never been taught, murmured in a rhythm that has nothing to do with Latin, and in the deepest part of that dream, a tunnel curves toward nowhere, lit only by the warmth of those who believed enough to crawl. You wake with grit beneath your fingernails. You don't remember putting your hands near the hearth. If your eyes are fading, let them. The story wasn't waiting for anyone. The next morning, the ovens are hotter than usual. Someone started them early. The scent is stronger. The loaves rise higher. And yet, attention pulses beneath the tasks, humming low like a note the rest of the melody forgot. You glance once more at the corner by the crack. It hasn't changed, but you have. And maybe, just maybe, that's the first step not downward, but inward, towards something that was never buried, just waiting, toward the hidden lives of medieval nuns' lives, lived not in defiance of faith, but in search of a faith that allowed movement, that allowed breath, that allowed tunnels to exist, even if only in the space between two prayers. Maps, in places like this, aren't supposed to exist, at least not the kind that lead anywhere unexpected. The only maps one should need inside a convent are those etched in muscle memory, the path from cell to chapel, from kitchen to cloister, from silence to deeper silence. Every corridor is meant to mirror the soul's journey, simple, obedient, without deviation. To know more than that would be to stray. To stray would be to question, and questioning, here, is always an act performed alone. Still, there are whispers of a parchment not officially catalogued, not folded among the cartularies, and certainly not mentioned aloud. You never see it handed over. It doesn't appear during scriptorium hours. It has no label, no seal, no proper Latin title. But you hear its absence. You feel its gravity. The way Sister Clemence closes a hymnal too tightly. The way ink stains appear on fingers that never held quills. The way a folded square of linen seems too stiff, too careful, too weighted with something other than thread. You first glimpse it without realizing what you're seeing. It's late. The rain has softened the mortar so completely that the walls sweat at the seams. You are gathering votive scraps, left to dry in the apothecary's annex, when a faint draft lifts the corner of a cloth meant to cover a devotional illustration. Beneath it lies something old, not ancient, but older than anything still in use. Vellum, browned at the edges, warped by time. You reach to fold it back, expecting a psalm, a blessing, perhaps a recipe for ink or balm. But it isn't that. It's a diagram, not detailed, not labeled, but unmistakably architectural. A square corridor, a room beyond the wall, a curve that shouldn't be there. And at the edge, in the margin where titles usually sit, a mark, scratched so lightly you almost miss it, a symbol like a lantern with no flame. You don't breathe for a moment, not because of what it is, but because of what it could be. The room beyond the wall looks like nothing you know. Its lines are wrong, too round for a storeroom, too isolated for a chapel, too deliberately concealed to be an accident. You've walked these halls for months. You've counted bricks, measured distance, traced cold lines on colder walls. That room shouldn't exist. And yet there it is, not imagined, not inferred, but drawn. You tuck it away, not in your sleeve, that would be too risky. You press it instead between the pages of a psalter, choosing a passage no one reads aloud anymore. Then you return to your duties, carefully, slowly, aware of every eye that might be watching without seeming to watch at all. Later that night, examine the drawing more carefully. The ink is iron gall, faded to brown, the style stiff and careful, not the sweeping elegance of formal scribes, but the hesitant certainty of someone untrained yet deliberate. It wasn't meant for display. It was meant to survive, to be hidden, to be passed from hand to hand until it found the right one. You run your finger along the marked lines, tracing the route from the bread room to the space beyond. It's possible that it's simply a mistake, a superstition, an imagined place created by a mind that needed something more. But deep down, you know better. The hidden lives of medieval nuns were shaped not only by devotion, but by memory. Memory of the world before the walls. Memory of choices that could not be voiced. Memory of pain not permitted to bloom into grief. That map, with its cautious lines and secret curves, wasn't drawn in rebellion. It was drawn in remembrance, a way of marking something the world had decided to forget or to bury. You recall fragments of passing conversation. Sister Noemi once murmuring about an extra door in the old plans. The abbess shifting too quickly when someone asked about the lower west annex. And then there was the day a young postulant was sent away, not for disobedience, but for asking why the chapel's south window never lit at sunrise. Piece by piece, the puzzle forms not through clarity, but through omission, through the patterns in what no one will say. You consider showing it to someone, just one person, someone who would know the risks and yet still understand, but you don't. Not yet. Not because you fear what might happen, but because something inside you wants to sit with the knowledge a little longer, to feel the weight of knowing something you weren't supposed to know. In a place where secrets are currency and silence is confession, holding something unspoken can feel like power, or at least like proof that you still exist beneath the veil. The next morning, a new sheet of parchment appears at your desk in the scriptorium. It's blank, perfectly clean, too new to be coincidence. You're meant to copy a passage from Gregory, something about discipline and divine order, but your hand moves instead toward the map. Not to copy it, not yet, but to measure its proportions, to commit its shape to memory. You trace the curves mentally, converting each line to movement 3 steps past the final oven. Turn left near the disused basin. Press along the base of the wall. You feel ridiculous. You feel alive. That night, during Compline, the abbess's voice falters during the 3rd psalm. Not in pitch, her tone remains steady, but in timing. A pause too long between verses, a breath too sharp. No one comments, no one breaks rhythm, but a ripple passes through the room like wind through tall grass. After prayers, you return the map to its hiding place, whispering a line from the Psalter, where you've hidden it not as protection, but as promise. The path of the righteous is level. You make straight the way of the just. You don't know if it's true, but it feels like a key. That evening, while preparing incense for the altar, you find a single mark etched faintly on the brass base of the censer, a small circle bisected with a line. You've seen that symbol before, not in books, not in scripture, on the map. Someone else remembers, someone else still draws. The hidden lives of medieval nuns weren't always hidden by force. Sometimes, they were hidden by need, the need to endure without explanation, to act without evidence, to build meaning out of fragments when the world offered no whole. That map is not merely a diagram of stone and shadow. It is an act of belief, not in dogma, but in escape, not from faith, but towards something deeper than any doctrine was willing to name. It becomes your secret companion. Not physically, you don't carry it, but in thought, in posture, in the way your steps begin to angle more deliberately, how your eyes pause just a breath longer on door frames, how your fingers linger near seams in the mortar when no one is looking. There is no plan, not yet, but the knowledge has changed you. You are no longer simply within the convent. Now, part of you is beneath it, and it's waiting. Dust is not unusual here. In fact, it is expected. It gathers in corners the way silence pools in the folds of habits. It settles gently along the edges of prayer benches, fills the spine of unused hymnals, and weaves into the hems of robes that have outlasted the sisters who once wore them. It belongs to the rhythm of this place, as natural as bells, as predictable as breath. But the dust beneath the apse's stairs is different. You don't know it at first, not with your eyes, not even with your touch. It's something your body notices before your mind permits meaning, the way the dust clings too tightly to the underside of your sleeves, the way its color runs darker than the rest, a shade not of age, but of earth. There is a smell to it, too faint, metallic, like a memory of rain in a cave. You only reach it because you were sent for candles. The small storeroom near the apse is not often used. The larger wax stores are more convenient, more orderly, better lit. But Sister Renata asked for a particular shape, the older kind, thin and long, rolled by hand decades ago, and reserved for fast days. You were told exactly where to look. You were not told to step on the second stair, and yet you do, not by mistake, not on purpose, simply because that is where your foot lands, guided by the light that flickers unpredictably, and by something quieter that seems to breathe from the stones themselves. The step groans beneath your weight, not loudly, but differently than the others, not in protest, but in memory. You pause, listening. The room behind you does not echo. The candles remain untouched. You lower yourself to the edge of the stair, fingers brushing aside a thin layer of dust to reveal a narrow line between stone and frame, not a crack, not yet, but a boundary, one that does not belong to the uniform geometry of a convent built by prayer and repetition. This seam is older than doctrine, or perhaps newer than rules. It speaks of motion, of hands that pried, then smoothed, of something once opened, and now only sleeping. Dust does not usually rise. It drifts. It falls. But as your knuckle grazes the edge of the step, a fine trail lifts into the air, not lofted by movement, but released, as if the surface had been waiting to exhale. It spirals upward like incense, but without warmth, without purpose, without the blessing of fire. This dust is not sacred, and you know, without understanding why, that it does not belong to God. You try to brush it away, not because it alarms you, but because it lingers too long. It resettles on your skin, into your sleeves, against the soft part of your throat. There is a weight to it, as though it remembers more than it should. The hidden lives of medieval nuns were lived beneath layers of silence, of obedience, of ritual that comforted and contained in equal measure. But beneath even those layers lay something grittier, something unprocessed. They were women born with lungs and hunger and names they had not chosen. They lived by prayers written by others, on rules interpreted by men, and by candles lit for souls they might never meet. Beneath all that, there was dust, and some of it did not come from time. Some of it came from trying to carve space when there was none to spare. You bring the candles back, of course. You say nothing of the stair. That is the only rule you have not been taught but already know by heart. Speak nothing of what should remain beneath. But later, as you wash your hands at the basin, the dust doesn't leave. It clings beneath your nails, beneath your knuckles, and somewhere along the creases of your wrist. It leaves a faint line, a mark not made by ash or ink, but by touch. You do not scrub it away. You let it settle, and as you walk back toward your cell, past the choir stalls, past the mural where angels hold open books they've never read, you begin to notice how many other surfaces are too clean, how often corners are swept twice, how often the same sisters polish the same doorknob 3 times over, as if they are not cleaning the dust away, but keeping something hidden underneath it. There is a space near the eastern transept that no one ever lingers in. It is not forbidden, but it is avoided. And the floor there bears a pattern, not of tiles, but of pacing. You see it now, as if the dust were receding only for you. A curved mark, shallow and scuffed, where the edges of a habit hem might have brushed against stone again and again. A half circle, incomplete. A motion not from devotion, but from waiting. You kneel beside it, not in prayer, but in presence. And the floor is warm, not warm with sunlight, not warm from feet, warm from below. You remember the map, not its lines, those you burned into memory long ago, but the symbol at its corner, the unlit lantern, drawn without fire, and now, without trying. You see it again, not on parchment, but in shape, the curve of the pacing mark, the outline of the room beyond the stair, the way the dust moves when no one is looking. You are not afraid, but you are aware. This place, which taught you how to be still, is beginning to teach you how to move. You hear the voice before you see the figure, not in words, just a throat cleared, deliberately, once, behind you, standing not close, not distant, stands Sister Hortensia. Her expression holds nothing, not disapproval, not concern, only presence. She does not speak of the dust. She does not ask what you saw. She only says, very softly, some things are meant to stay under the bread. And then she leaves. No footsteps, no backward glance. You don't follow, but you remember. Later that evening, during the final psalm, your eyes drift from the pages. You're no longer looking for words. You're watching where dust drifts, where it gathers. You're reading the floor, the beams, the folds of the robes around you, not for meaning, but for movement. Dust does not belong to God, not always, but it tells his stories better than ink, because it does not argue. It only remembers where things were. You realize something else. The dust that clings to you, it is not from this convent alone. It is older, hungrier. It wants to be known. And so, for the first time, you whisper to it. Not a prayer, just a promise. You say, I see you, and the dust, though silent, settles more gently on your skin. There is a kind of silence particular to the choir stalls, not the silence of stillness, nor the reverent quiet held in chapels before dawn, but a deep, rehearsed hush that has been polished across generations of kneeling spines and bowed heads. It is not simply the absence of noise. It is the result of centuries of breath held at the same note, of hands folded against laps, not because they were idle, but because they dared not tremble. It is a silence that sings before any psalm begins. You take your place, as you always do, 3 stalls from the end on the left side, where the wood has been softened by the weight of many. The bench creaks under you, but only slightly a familiar complaint in a room accustomed to more pressing sorrows. The other sisters arrive in staggered rhythm, robes brushing against stone and wood in small, forgotten harmonies. No one speaks. Words are not welcome here, not unless they come dressed in melody and blessed by Latin. The cantor begins the antiphon, voice rising not boldly, but with the resigned grace of someone who has spent her life singing into spaces too large to ever be filled. And yet, something is off. Not wrong, not broken, simply shifted. A note, perhaps the third in the sequence, returns not with echo but with dissonance subtle, barely perceptible, but enough to tighten the breath of those who know these acoustics by heart. You tilt your head slightly, as though listening harder might correct the sound, but it does not. The note passes again, and again it lands oddly, as if part of the chapel itself no longer wished to resonate with it. You glance at the others. Most do not notice, or pretend not to. But 2 stalls ahead, Sister Adele stiffens. Her shoulders rise a fraction. Her hand, previously steady on the psalter, tightens along the edge of the page. You are not imagining it, and now that you've heard it, you begin to feel it. The air in this corner is heavier, not in temperature, not in weight, but in tone, like music pressing against a surface that has shifted shape without warning. The choir stall you occupy is no longer aligned with the rest, not architecturally, but spiritually. It is responding to something else, or resisting it. After the final chord fades, there is a moment, a breath longer than usual, where no one moves. And in that pause, you hear it again, not the music, but what lies beneath it. A subtle, hollow sound, too deep for voice, too soft for footsteps, as if the floor beneath your stall carries more than stone. Later, when the chapel has emptied, and the candles have been left to consume themselves in slow resignation, you return, not boldly, not recklessly, simply with the careful precision of someone who has learned that mystery is more easily welcomed when it is not asked to announce itself. You kneel in the same place, pressing your palm flat against the wood, feeling for that echo, the one that doesn't belong to voice or prayer. It's still there, faint, rhythmic, persistent, a beat behind your own pulse out. The choir stalls were built centuries ago, crafted by hands long returned to soil, their wood carved from forests no longer standing. They were meant to endure, and they have. But what they hold is not just the weight of bodies. It is the memory of presence and absence, of the voices that once rose here, and of those that never dared speak at all. The hidden lives of medieval nuns often made themselves known not through confession, but through sound, the way a psalm caught in the throat, the way a prayer was rushed or slowed, the subtle shift of harmonies that betrayed the unrest of the soul beneath. And now, in this quiet space between practices, you begin to understand that something or someone once tried to communicate not with words, but with resonance. You press your ear to the wooden backrest, not enough to draw attention, but enough to hear what has long gone unnoticed. There is no voice, but there is air, moving, breathing, somewhere beneath. It could be a draft, or it could be a passage. That evening, you trace the layout of the choir in your mind, connecting what you've felt to what you've seen. The curved pacing mark near the apse, the draft in the bread room, the seam in the step below the wax closet, and now this, a hollow resonance beneath a choir stall designed to face heaven, but now facing something else. You are not drawing a map, you are following one, and perhaps that is why, when Sister Clemence finds you in the cloister garden just before dusk, she says nothing at first. She only sits beside you on the worn bench, adjusting her robe to cover her shoes in that small, habitual act of modesty. For a moment, you both listen to the birds, not because they matter, but because it helps to look outward when what waits within is too wide to hold. Then, softly, she says, there is a crack behind the organ casing. You say nothing, not because you don't understand, but because you do. She continues, it's been repaired 3 times, but it always returns. The wood doesn't warp, the air does. Her voice doesn't tremble, it doesn't whisper. It simply delivers a sentence worn smooth by repetition, like a prayer passed between too many hands. She stands, smoothing the front of her tunic, and places a folded scrap beside you on the bench. You don't open it until she's gone. You already know what it is. And yet, when you unfold the paper, your hands still pause, because the lines drawn there thin, wavering, clearly etched in haste, match the curve you've felt beneath your feet. The outline passes directly beneath the choir stalls. It leads from nowhere to somewhere, and then vanishes. No destination marked, just a single word beside the endpoint reach. You lie awake that night, not restless, but waiting. The convent breathes its nightly rhythm, the creak of settling beams, the cough of someone too old for silence, the distant clink of metal on stone where vessels are washed before morning. But beneath it all, there is that echo not imagined, not feared, but present. It hums through your ribs like a second song. You think of all the voices that have sung here, through plague and peace, through doubt and devotion. Not all of them believed. Not all of them stayed, and some, perhaps, left not by gate or dismissal, but through the hollow behind the hymns. The hidden lives of medieval nuns were shaped not by what they said, but by how they sang. Some used melody to rise. Others used it to disappear. You wonder which kind you are becoming. She did not speak of it, not once, not even when asked directly. And there were questions, whispered and plain, murmured and barbed, each dressed in politeness but lined with suspicion. But she met them all with the same calm, unbothered silence, the kind that comes not from innocence, but from knowledge too heavy to be handed over. It was her eyes that gave her away, not her lips the way they flickered toward corners no one had taught her to notice, the way they hesitated a heartbeat too long over shadows, as if waiting for them to move. You first noticed the mud, not on the hem of her habit that was common enough, but on her knees, soaked through the fabric in twin stains so dark they seemed like bruises. This was not the light smudge of a garden kneel, nor the dust gathered from hours scrubbing tiles. It was rich, deep soil, the kind that clings when one has knelt in a space not meant to be found, the kind that lives beneath the world built above it. The morning she arrived in that state was unremarkable otherwise. The bells had rung on time. The dawn had broken without drama. The bread was risen. The psalms chanted. The candles lit. But she entered the refectory slower than usual, and when she sat, she winced not with the sharpness of injury, but the dull ache of effort remembered. You saw her glance once toward the cloister arches, where rainwater gathered along the edges of worn stone, and then return her gaze to her plate with the quiet determination of someone not yet ready to be asked what she had done. No one mentioned it. That was the rule, not because it had been spoken aloud, but because the very air discouraged inquiry. This was a convent where silence was not just reverence, but protection, a kind of invisible shawl worn over the shoulders of those who carried more than prayer in their veins. And this novice, with her dirt-caked robes and unspeaking mouth, had stepped into that silence with the ease of someone who knew exactly where not to tread. Later, you found yourself tracing her path in reverse. You had not intended to. You told yourself you were looking for herbs, for lavender, for the last wild mint that still clung to life near the cloister well. But your feet knew better than your excuse. They carried you to the eastern side of the garden, where the path narrowed into a crooked strip of moss-covered flagstone, and then narrowed further into nothing at all. There, just beyond the reach of routine, you saw it a patch of earth turned recently, messily, as though disturbed not by tools but by hands. The dirt bore no footprints, but it remembered them. You crouched beside it, not touching, not yet, and let your fingers hover just above the surface. The smell rose to meet you, damp, metallic, old, not the clean scent of garden soil, but something deeper. Clay, root, maybe bone. You thought again of the mud on her knees, and for the first time, you began to understand that some prayers were offered downward not to heaven, but to whatever waited beneath. The hidden lives of medieval nuns were not all shaped in stone and scripture. Some were carved in mud and bruised through devotion not to liturgy, but to motion quiet, secret, purposeful motion. These were the lives that crawled where others walked, that learned to measure time not in bells, but in breaths held under floorboards. Lives that needed no audience, because they were never written for one. You waited until evening, until the corridors dimmed, and the sisters began their murmured procession toward Compline. Then you returned to the garden, taking the longer path so as not to be seen, carrying only a small cloth and the name of no one on your tongue. The patch of disturbed earth remained, but something had changed. The soil was cooler now, firmer, as if a decision had been made in your absence. You touched it gently, not digging, merely testing, and felt the subtle shift below the faint echo of space. Not large, not hollow, but real. You didn't uncover it. You didn't try. You had already seen enough. Later that night, she entered the chapel late, not obscenely so, just enough to mark her. The others did not look, or they looked without turning. But you noticed her limp, subtle, and more pronounced when descending steps. She walked not like someone wounded, but like someone adjusting to unfamiliar angles, to narrow spaces, to stone where there should have been soil. She did not sing, but she bowed her head during the psalms with a focus that was almost unsettling, as if listening not to the voices around her, but to something older echoing beneath them, something that answered in a key too low to be heard. You found yourself watching her more closely, not with suspicion, but with recognition. The way she touched walls in passing, not constantly, but deliberately, as if counting bricks beneath her palm. The way she turned at corners never too quickly, always with one ear tilted slightly toward the floor. She had become part of the convent, the way water becomes part of stone, not by fitting in, but by finding where to press. Then, one evening, she was gone. No announcement, no letter. Her bed was made, her robe folded, her sandals lined up beneath the cot with the kind of care only given by those who know they will not return. No trace of departure, no word from the abbess, only a single candle left burning at the foot of her blanket unlit, half melted, and marked with a symbol you had only seen once before. A lantern, unlit, drawn by hand, If your breath has disappeared into the dark good, that's where the rest of this belongs. The others said nothing, not even in private. It was as if she had never arrived, as if the name they had spoken for months had been scrubbed from the registry, from memory, from the altar itself. But you remembered. You remembered the mud, the limp, the earth turned soft in places where earth should not have been touched. And you remembered the sound that had changed in the choir stall, the hollow note, still unresolved. It returned that week, deeper this time, thicker, as if something beneath had grown stronger in her absence, or more awake. You began to hear it in other places too, in the apothecary, beneath the alcove outside the chapel, even beneath your cell, once, late at night, when the wind was still and even your heartbeat had slowed. It was there, not knocking, not calling, simply existing, waiting, as if now it had found your name and was willing to speak it. The hidden lives of medieval nuns were not just about what they hid, they were about what they found. In darkness, in motion, in the quiet surrender of knees pressed to soil not consecrated, but claimed. Whatever she had discovered or re-entered, or finished, she had done so alone, but not unmarked and not unseen, because even now, the mud still stains the steps near the cloister well. No one has scrubbed it. No one has asked. But you see it, and maybe that is enough. It arrived folded, not as a letter, not as a record, but as something in between, a sliver of parchment folded into fourths and slipped between the pages of a devotional that hadn't been touched in years. You found it, not while searching, but while waiting during one of those quiet hours in the scriptorium when the air grows thick with the scent of wax and old vellum, when even the scratching of quills seems too loud, too mechanical, too far from the human pulse that once shaped these pages. You opened the book because the light had fallen a certain way on its cracked spine, illuminating its dust like motes of breath suspended mid-fall. You ran your hand along the edge, letting your fingertips feel the ridges, the memory of other hands that had turned these same pages. And there, tucked like a pressed flower, forgotten or purposefully hidden, was the confession. There was no name, no signature, no date, just a single, even script, careful, restrained, painfully elegant in its clarity. The ink had faded, browned slightly with time, but the hand that wrote it had pressed deliberately. Each letter stood upright, like a body trying to remain composed under scrutiny. It did not plead. It did not waver. It simply said what it came to say. I dug with a spoon, not because I believed I would succeed, but because I could not sit still beneath the weight of what I had promised. The floor was colder than I expected, harder, but not unforgiving. It gave, slowly, as if reluctant to help, but unwilling to refuse. You read the first paragraph and stop, not because you cannot continue, but because you feel suddenly watched, not by anyone in the room, but by the words themselves, by the slow, breathing presence of someone who wrote not to be heard, but to release something they could no longer contain. You turn slightly, shielding the parchment from the window, letting your breath settle before reading on. I marked my progress in prayers, one Ave for each inch of dirt removed. Though I'm not sure anymore if that was penance or measurement. I learned the sounds of the earth beneath the walls, not the living earth of gardens or fields, but the old earth, packed by time and silence, pressed flat by the memory of too many feet. I found stones with faces in them, roots like veins, bones that may have been animal, or not. You stop again, though the words do not demand it. They continue without pause, but you do not. You've seen bones in the apothecary, clean ones, labeled, catalogued for tinctures and teachings. But this is not that. This is not for knowledge. This is for release. You press your thumb to the edge of the parchment, grounding yourself. The others in the scriptorium are silent, absorbed in their own copying, their own small rituals of obedience. You could fold this note back, pretend it never surfaced. You could burn it. You could hand it to the abbess and let the weight pass from you to her. But you don't. Because some truths, once read, settle inside you. They become a second breath. You read on. I do not know how deep I went. I only know that the light stopped reaching after the seventh night, and still I dug. I do not know if I was building an escape or a grave. Perhaps both. Perhaps they are the same. The line lingers. It's not poetic, not designed for drama. It's just honest, quietly so. The kind of truth whispered only to earth, or to pages that will not answer back. You keep reading. My hands bled. My knees cracked. I lied to the infirmarian about the swelling, said it was cold, said it was penance, said it was nothing. No one looked twice. I think they knew, but chose not to name it. Naming is dangerous here. It makes things real. And now you feel something shift inside you, not fear, not even unease, but something colder, something you do not yet have a name for, because you have lied too. Small lies, gentle ones, the kind that slip easily through the fabric of a habit, disguised as humility. You said you hadn't noticed the crack behind the choir. You said you hadn't returned to the garden's eastern wall. You said the novice's departure didn't trouble you. But the truth is, you carry all of it, tucked quietly behind your ribs. You wonder, as you hold the parchment, who else has carried it? If it has passed hand to hand, read in silence by eyes not yet ready to understand. Or if it waited for you specifically, impossibly, patiently until you were still enough to listen. You reach the final lines. I have not found the end. Only more earth. More silence. But I know now that there is something beneath the prayers, something that hums differently when we sleep. If I do not return, let it be known that I tried not to flee, but to reach. There is a difference. Please remember the difference. The ink ends there. No sign-off, no farewell, only space. And somehow, that space feels fuller than anything else on the page, as if even the act of ending had to remain unfinished, as if the writer had descended into whatever passage they'd carved, and simply decided never to climb back out. You fold the parchment carefully, precisely along the existing creases. You do not return it to the book. You do not burn it. You place it instead within your sleeve, against the inside of your wrist, where the skin is thinner, where the pulse runs closest to the surface. You need to feel it, to remind yourself that this was written by someone with blood and doubt and hands that shook just like yours. That evening, as you walk the corridor past the refectory, the long, shadowed stretch between the garden and the kitchens, you begin to hear it again, that subtle shift beneath your steps, like a voice pressed between the stones. Not a voice of sound, a voice of presence, of intent. And for the first time, you do not step more lightly to avoid it. You let your footfall land fully. You let the sound meet you, because the hidden lives of medieval nuns were not defined by obedience alone. They were also shaped by the quiet revolutions whispered into corners, by the soft movements of those who chose to dig instead of kneel, by the lives that carried their questions into the earth instead of waiting for permission to ask them aloud. You return to your cell late. You do not light a candle. You do not sleep immediately. You lie on your side, the folded confession still tucked against your wrist, and you listen not for voices, not for dreams, but for the hum that carries beneath the quiet. the one the writer described, the one you now recognize. It does not frighten you, it simply waits. And now, so do you. It began with the door. Not a loud slam, nor a dramatic swing, but a subtle refusal, a hesitation, just short of closing, as if the frame no longer remembered its alignment. The storeroom near the west wing had never been of particular interest, a small, dim space filled with wooden crates, bundles of coarse linen, and broken candlesticks too humble to repair, but too holy to discard. But after the third day of unrelenting rain, something changed. You passed by on your way to the washing corridor and noticed that the door, which had always fallen shut with a low sigh, now remained half open, not pulled ajar, not propped, just refusing. It was the kind of shift one might blame on weather, on swollen wood, on dampened hinges, on the groaning complaints of a building absorbing the sky's sorrow. But when you stepped inside, it became immediately clear that the air within did not match the air without. The rain had made the rest of the convent dense with moisture, heavy with the smell of soaked stone and earth. But in this room, the air remained oddly cold, not fresh, not sweet, but still and old, like something had been sealed too tightly for too long. You moved slowly across the room, careful not to disturb the stacks of folded altar cloths, the tin lanterns hanging from iron hooks, the ancient wheel of rope sitting curled like a sleeping animal in the corner. Every object seemed just slightly displaced, not enough to call it disturbed, but enough to make you wonder if it had once belonged elsewhere, as though the room had shifted just enough to misremember its own purpose. And then there was the floor. At first glance, it looked like every other floor in the convent, uneven flagstone, darkened by age and polish, worn down to a satin sheen beneath the feet of many. But beneath your step, something felt different. Not in texture, in balance. The kind of imbalance that lingers in the back of your calves when the earth tilts, ever so slightly, away from where it used to be. You knelt beside one of the larger crates, as if to rest, as if to think, but what you were doing, in truth, was listening. And what you heard was not silence. It was weight. Not heavy, but waiting. Something beneath the stone pressing upward. Not with force, but with presence. A soft tension, like breath withheld in a crowded room. The hidden lives of medieval nuns were not lived only in cloisters and cells, in kitchens and chapels. They unfolded in spaces like this, quiet spaces, misaligned with the visible world, where nothing dramatic declared itself, but everything had been nudged just enough to remind you that the world beneath the surface still stirred. These were rooms that remembered things they were never supposed to witness, rooms that had absorbed too many secrets through stone, too many stories through dust. You moved your palm across the floor, pausing where one slab dipped a fraction too far, just enough to suggest subsidence or something less innocent. And in that moment, you felt the faintest shift not of the stone, not even of the air, but of space itself, as if the room had adjusted under you, not structurally, but spiritually. The way grief repositions itself when acknowledged, the way a lie grows heavier when someone starts to believe it. Later, when you returned with Sister Renata under the pretense of needing additional linens, the door refused to close again. She noticed it. Of course, the way it hovered, the gap where light slipped in from the corridor, but she said nothing. Instead, she paused near the threshold, gazed once toward the ceiling, and then placed her basket beside the wall with more force than necessary. It was not an accident. She was marking the moment. As you folded the cloths in silence, she finally spoke, not looking at you, not raising her voice, just placing the words where they could not be ignored. There used to be another wall here. You said nothing, unsure whether this was memory or metaphor. Before the last repairs, she added, or perhaps before the last story about the repairs. You met her eyes, but she offered nothing further. The silence that followed did not ask for reply. It asked for recognition, and in your nod, she found it. That night, the rain intensified. The roof above the chapel groaned. Water trickled through the gaps in the arches and left thin, shining trails along the floor. But it was not the water that disturbed your sleep. It was the sound, not loud, not sharp, but persistent, a low, resonant creaking, like timber straining under memory. You rose, pulled your shawl close, and followed it. The corridor was dark. The lanterns had all been extinguished, but you knew the path. You had walked it enough times now, first in duty, then in curiosity, now in something more like longing. When you reached the storeroom, the door was, for the first time, fully closed. You placed your palm against the wood, feeling its grain, the way the moisture had thickened its texture. And still, that sound continued not from inside the room, but from beneath it. You opened the door slowly. The hinges did not protest. They welcomed the motion. Inside, the room had shifted again. You could feel it even before stepping across the threshold. The weight of it, the pull. Not gravity, but memory. The kind that makes your chest tighten without understanding why. And then you saw it. One of the floor stones had lifted, not broken, not shattered, just lifted by a hair's breadth, enough to let the rainwater find it, enough to let the faintest glint of something deeper shimmer through the thin layer of pooled light. You did not lift it. You did not touch it. You simply sat beside it, legs crossed beneath your robe, hands resting gently in your lap, and listened. And what you heard was not movement. It was waiting. You remained there longer than you intended, long enough that the candles in the corridor had to be relit, long enough that your knees began to ache. But you did not leave, because you understood now that this room, this humble, half-forgotten storeroom had remembered something. It had remembered its shape. It had remembered its weight. It had remembered that it once belonged to something wider, something beneath. And in that remembering, it had asked you to witness it. The hidden lives of medieval nuns were never only in the choices they made, but in the places that held those choices for them, in the spaces that shifted ever so slightly when someone stepped inside who might understand, in the stones that tilted just enough to make you stop. And sometimes, when the rain is heavy enough, the room remembers how to speak. Not in words, but in the sound of a door that no longer fits its frame, in the chill that seeps up from a floor that used to be solid, in the way water pools along the seam of a stone that was never meant to move. You left before dawn, quietly, slowly, but not the same. And when you returned to your cell, sleep did not come. Only stillness. Only the echo of a room that had shifted in the rain. There is something quietly theatrical about a convent garden. Its geometry, its ritual, its balance of control and surrender. Every hedge trimmed, every path deliberate, every herb planted in rows that reflect the symmetry of monastic life. From a distance, it all appears serene, a vision of divine order. But when you kneel closer, when you brush your hand through the lavender or tilt your head toward the roots of the sage, you find that the garden is not as tame as it pretends to be. Things shift beneath the surface. Seeds sprout where none were sown. Certain patches, no matter how often cleared, seem always to bloom with weeds no one recalls naming. The patch near the southern wall is one of those places. Not large, no more than a few strides wide, but stubborn. Every few weeks, someone is assigned to clear it. They bring shears, trowels, sometimes fire, and yet it always returns. thick with curling vines and creeping moss, its soil darker than the beds beside it, its scent richer, sharper, almost sweet with decay. It doesn't match the rest of the garden, and perhaps that is why, though no one has forbidden it, no one lingers there longer than they must. You remember the first time you were assigned to it. The day had been cool and bright, the kind of light that flattens shadows, offering no invitation to mystery. You brought your tools with diligence, tied your apron tightly, and approached the bed with the quiet focus of someone eager to do well. But the moment your trowel pierced the soil, something resisted. Not physically, it broke apart like any other earth, but rhythmically, as though you were disrupting not dirt, but memory. The smell rose sharply, unlike anything in the nearby plots. Not the clean, peppery tang of marjoram or the soft bitterness of thyme, but something deeper, wet stone, rotten bark, and beneath it, something faintly metallic, not blood, not iron, but close enough to both that your fingers tingled as you turned the soil. You found no bones, no markings, only roots too many, too tangled, growing in directions that made no sense, twisting in upon themselves like fingers interlaced in desperation. You unearthed a knot the size of your palm and held it up to the light, trying to make sense of its shape. It looked almost carved, but nature had done the carving. That night, you could still smell it beneath your nails, even after scrubbing, even after prayers. You told no one. It was Sister Leonard who first used the word resistant, she said, carefully, as the two of you passed by the southern bed on your way to Vespers. Not cursed, not sacred, just resistant. You glanced at her, half expecting elaboration, but she didn't look back. Her eyes remained on the path ahead. Her hands were clasped, as they always were, fingers worrying the frayed edge of her sleeve. She didn't need to explain. The word had done enough. And she was right. The garden there did not feel malicious. It didn't ache with danger. But it refused. It refused to behave. It refused to be blessed. It refused to die. And that, in a place where obedience was virtue, was cause enough for suspicion. Over time, you began to observe the changes more carefully. The way the soil there stayed damp even in drought. The way certain birds never landed there, even when seed was scattered. The way, once, a candle stub buried nearby emerged 2 days later, upright and untouched by flame, as though the ground had exhaled it deliberately. You didn't report that either. The hidden lives of medieval nuns were often shaped by what grew in places no one expected. Not just gardens, but glances, gestures, paths traced over time without ever being drawn. Some called it intuition, others called it sin. Most never called it anything, for fear that naming it would give it form. You learned to stop trying to change the bed. Instead, you began to visit it without tools, just to watch, to sit near it during the hour when the sun reached the wall at an angle so sharp the garden looked like a painting half unfinished. And it was then that you began to notice a pattern not in the plants, but in the ground itself. The soil near the center of the bed was slightly higher than the rest, forming a gentle rise, just enough to suggest that something lay beneath it. A stone, perhaps, a root cluster. But no matter how often you measured, it never seemed to settle. After every rain, the rise grew more defined. After every heat spell, it shrank back again, like breath, or like memory under pressure. Then came the day the lavender was planted. It had not been your decision. The abbess had ordered it, part of a plan to unify the garden with a single scent. Order through fragrance, she'd said, devotion through harmony. And so a dozen stalks were brought, roots cleaned and ready, petals pale with early bloom. You were told to assist. You planted them carefully, measured the spacing, pressed the soil with reverence, and for a few days they held, until the rain came. Not heavy, just persistent. A low, murmuring rain that fell for 2 days and 2 nights, soft enough not to flood, long enough to test the earth. On the 3rd morning, the southern bed had changed. Not violently, not dramatically, but every lavender stalk had turned slightly, not wilted, not dead, simply reoriented as though leaning towards something below, something that had whispered during the rain. And in the center of the bed, where the earth always rose and fell, there was now a small hollow, barely wide enough for a hand, just enough to be noticed. You knelt beside it. You did not reach in, but you leaned closer. And what you smelled was not rot. It was breath, old breath, cool and still, as though the earth had exhaled only once, and then waited. You covered the hollow with care, no words, no gestures, just soil. And then you walked away. If something in here found you first, say so, just once. This is Boring History Nights. You returned every week, as others did, to tend to the garden. But you never tried to tame the southern bed again. The lavender never bloomed properly there. Its scent remained faint. The petals fell early, and yet the stalks never died. They stood, quietly stubborn, season after season, bending always slightly inward. You once watched a bird, a crow, maybe land near the edge of the bed and hop forward, curious. It stood a moment, head tilted, then cawed once and flew off without taking anything. Even the animals knew. The hidden lives of medieval nuns were not grown in rows. They were not pruned or pressed or dried. They were wildflowers in shadows, roots beneath walls, petals that opened in secret. Some grew despite the light, others because of the dark. And some, like this garden, simply kept growing, because forgetting would have meant dying. And they weren't ready yet. Neither are you. There are dreams that arrive like whispers, thin, vaporous, gently confused with memory. And then there are those that settle with a certainty too heavy for sleep, as if they had been waiting long before you closed your eyes. You dreamt of a corridor, not a new one, and not from the convent as you know it. Its stones were familiar, but dimmed, as if soaked in time. There were no walls at either end, only distance, and the only sound was your own breath, echoing faintly, as if even in that imagined space you were not allowed to breathe freely. You awoke slowly, reluctant, not because of comfort, but because the waking world felt smaller than the one you just left. The weight of the blankets was suddenly too specific, the shape of your cell too defined, as if reality had chosen to shrink itself overnight. You sat up with the kind of stillness reserved for moments when the body feels the echo of a place it hasn't been, but somehow remembers. You didn't speak of the dream. You rose, washed, folded your blanket as expected, but you moved differently, as though the air had thickened or the walls had leaned in slightly, as though something from the dream had followed you back and was waiting now, just behind the stone. And for the first time, you felt it fully, the sensation that you were not merely within the convent, but somehow beside it, living just to the left of the expected rhythm, trailing along a path not laid by bells or rules, but by something quieter, a dream that never ended because it had never truly begun. You walked through the cloister that morning without haste, observing how the light filtered between the columns, not as illumination, but as memory. You watched the other sisters pass with their usual urgency, arms full of linen or water or food, their steps measured by centuries of repetition. You wondered how many of them had paused to feel the curve of the stone underfoot, how many had pressed their palms to the cold, not for warmth, but for confirmation that they were still part of it. The cloister had always been a place of containment, a square open to the sky, framed by arches, hemmed in by duty and prayer. It was meant to focus the mind inward, to fold the world into manageable shapes. But now, it felt like a border, a space you walked not to remain within, but to circle something just beyond reach. You began to notice the corners more, the sharp turn of wall into pillar, the chipped edge of an old bench, the way ivy had curled around one support beam and grown downward, against gravity, toward the ground. You had passed it 100 times before, but now you saw how the roots of that ivy traced a faint line in the stone, not carved, not painted, just pressed over time, a path not walked but grown. The dream returned to you that afternoon, not in sleep, but in stillness. During readings in the refectory, as voices rose and fell in practiced cadence, you found your mind slipping back to the corridor not in images, but in sensation. You felt again the heaviness of the air, the distance that refused to close. And then, between one breath and the next, you saw her, a woman walking ahead of you, her robe the same as yours, her hair cropped short beneath the veil, her posture straight, but not rigid, the kind of posture that comes from moving forward without knowing if you'll ever arrive. You didn't call out. You only watched. And in that moment of imagined clarity, you understood something that no one had taught. This was not just your dream. It belonged to others too. You found the Psalter again that evening, the one that had once held the unsigned confession, and turned its pages, not to find more writing, but to listen. The vellum whispered with every turn, not with words, but with resistance. You ran your fingertips along the margins, tracing the empty spaces as if they contained meaning, and paused on a page you could not recall seeing before. The psalm was familiar, but someone, at some forgotten point, had underlined a single phrase in faint red ink: "They shall be silent in the grave." You didn't flinch, but you closed the book slowly, not because of fear, but because you felt the words settle, not in your mind, but lower somewhere behind your ribs. The silence of the grave was something you had never feared. You had been trained not to. But now, it felt different. Not an ending, not even an absence. A boundary, perhaps. One that dreams crossed more easily than feet. The hidden lives of medieval nuns were not lived only in the waking hours, nor shaped entirely by scripture or habit. They were carved in the spaces between sleep and duty, in dreams that returned night after night, reshaping memory, bending time, reminding the body of places it had never been, yet still ached to return to. You dreamed again, that night. This time, you followed her, not closely, not with urgency, just enough to trace the path she walked. Her footsteps were soft, not silent, but gentle, as if she didn't want the stone to notice her passing. She moved along the corridor that curved ever so slightly, impossible geometry made sensible only within dream logic. And when she turned the corner, you expected to lose her. But you didn't, because you knew what lay beyond the turn, not through recognition, but through longing. She paused at a wall that shimmered slightly, not with light, but with breath, the faint condensation of presence. She placed her hand upon it, and as she did, you placed yours upon your mattress. The textures did not match, but the sensation did. A contact, a pulse, and a quiet hum of waiting. When you woke, the feeling lingered in your palm, not dampness, not heat, but memory. You didn't speak of it, but you did walk differently that morning, slower, as though something in you had shifted, a tide turning beneath still water. Later, you entered the cloister again, not for duty, but because you needed to. The wind had risen, brushing against your sleeves, stirring your veil. The birds in the far wall cooed quietly, unsettled. You stood in the northern corner, just beside the spot where the rain collected last week and revealed, for a moment, a faint line of brick that no one had noticed before. You followed it now, your fingers brushing lightly across the stone, counting as you moved 1, 2, 3, turn, 7, bend. It wasn't exact, but it matched the rhythm of your dream. And when you reached the final turn, you stopped. Not because there was anything there, but because your breath had changed. It came shallower, not from fear, but from recognition. The cloister had not changed. You had, and now, you could see the outline of the space you had visited in sleep, not in bricks or shadow, but in weight. A weight you carried with you, shaped not like guilt, not like sin, but like the knowing that elsewhere was not distant. It was here, just folded, just hidden, and perhaps just waiting. It is easy to assume that those who carry the keys understand the doors, that those who speak the liturgies by heart, who trace the altar cloth with hands steady from repetition, who stand at the head of every procession with robes unwrinkled and eyes focused straight ahead. It is easy to believe they do so without burden, or mystery, or the private ache of knowing more than they are ever permitted to say. But the abbess had always moved with a particular kind of restraint, one that was not born of fear, nor pride, nor ceremony. It was something older, something quieter, something that resembled reverence, but held within it a reluctance to belong completely to the very rituals she herself upheld. You had watched her for years, not closely, not with suspicion, but with the quiet attention that one gives to fixtures, to the worn shape of a stair, to the line of candle wax beneath the sconces, not out of curiosity, but because these things endure. She was like that, predictable, untouched by seasonal temperaments or shifting moods. And yet, there were moments when her gaze lingered too long on empty doorways, when her fingers hesitated mid-prayer, as if the words had suddenly reminded her of a choice never unmade. You never spoke to her outside of required phrases. Yes, Mother. No, Mother. Thanks be to God. But there were days when your silence met hers in the hallway, and in the space between your passing shoulders, there was the undeniable sense of something being held back, not by shame, but by decision, not out of uncertainty, but from an understanding too complete to permit further movement. It was on the morning of the feast of St. Agnes that you saw it most clearly. The sisters had gathered in the chapel as they always did, cloaks tightened at their shoulders, voices lifting in sacred tension. The air had taken on the perfume of old roses and wax, incense curling lazily toward the cold rafters. The readings passed like breaths sharp, expected, memorized. And then she stood the abbess to deliver her reflection, her voice steady as always, her tone neither warm nor cold, simply correct. But mid-sentence, something shifted. It wasn't in her voice, which did not crack, nor falter. It was in the silence between words, a pause that extended itself just enough to raise every head in the chapel. She looked not at the sisters, but toward the far apse, just to the left of the crucifix. And there, for the first time, you saw her lips part, not in speech, but in breath, as though something had startled her not from the outside, but from within. When she resumed, the words were intact, but her eyes did not return to the room. Later, as you were sweeping the corridor beside the chapel, you found a fragment of paper not torn, not dropped, but folded and placed carefully at the base of a stone shelf. There was no writing, only a drawing faint, hand-sketched, incomplete, a narrow arch, a half step down, a curving line that ended in a space shaded so softly it resembled breath more than shape. You slipped it into your robe. You did not look for more. You began to trace her movements after that, not in disobedience, but in longing. She was not young nor fragile, but she carried herself as someone whose footsteps weighed more than they revealed. She passed through the cloisters with purpose, but never speed. She entered the gardens only when the sun had receded, and though her cell was closest to the chapel, she always walked the long way back after evening prayers, choosing the southern corridor instead of the more direct western route. It was there that you noticed the hesitation, a subtle slowing near the alcove where the stone floor darkened with age. She never paused. She never touched the wall, but her step changed ever so slightly, as if the ground beneath her had shifted, or the air had thickened with remembrance. And it was then you realized she wasn't avoiding something. She was visiting it, gently, without ever arriving. The hidden lives of medieval nuns were not always hidden by force or forgetfulness. Sometimes they were protected by the very people charged with their erasure. The abbess, for all her formality, for all her repetition of rules, was not blind. She was simply still, like a tree that grew around a stone rather than move it. Her silence was not ignorance. It was preservation. You wondered then, as you do now, how many doors she had chosen not to open, not because she feared what lay beyond, but because she had once stepped through and come back. It was after Vespers, during the gray hour when the corridors fill with echoes, but no footsteps, that she called you. She did not raise her voice. She simply waited until you passed the cloister well, then stepped forward from the shadow of the stairwell, with her hands folded before her, the sleeves of her robe too still for the air that drifted there. You stopped. She said your name, not as a question, but as an anchor. Then, very softly, she asked, "Do you know what shape a vow makes, when it no longer fits?" You didn't answer. You weren't expected to. She looked beyond you, toward the archway, where the stones curve into the sacristy, and continued. "It bends," she said, slowly, without shattering, like wax left too close to heat. You felt the words rather than understood them. They pressed against your chest like memory, like dust. Then she placed something in your hand, a small object, wrapped in linen, still warm. "Not everything buried needs to be exhumed," she said, "but some things need to be known, even if only quietly." She turned, her steps already retreating, her form returning to the shadows. You did not unwrap the linen until you reached your cell, and even then, you hesitated. Inside, you found a shard of pottery curved, blackened, smoothed at one edge. It bore no markings, but pressed into the clay, almost invisible in the lamplight, was the shallow impression of a fingerprint. It wasn't hers, it wasn't yours, but someone, once, had held this fragment with hands trembling enough to leave a trace. The abbess never spoke to you again, not in that way, not with that kind of intimacy, but you began to see her differently, not as one who enforced silence, but as someone who had learned to survive within it, who had wrapped it around herself like a second habit, not to obscure, but to protect. She carried knowledge not as power, but as memory. She bore witness, not loudly, not publicly, but by refusing to forget what had not been permitted to remain. And in this, you began to understand the most painful truth of all, that to live beside a door without opening it requires not ignorance, but a kind of aching love. The hidden lives of medieval nuns were sometimes shepherded not by the bold, nor the defiant, but by the ones who watched, who waited, and who stayed when no one else could bear to. She had stayed, and though she never stepped through again, she left the threshold clean. For you, if none of this is making sense anymore, You're exactly where you should be. They were not designed for it, of course. They were made to stir lentils, to fold honey into oats, to press thick stews into ceramic bowls meant for shared silence and thin nourishment. They had no edge, no weight, no handle suited for force. Yet over time, under enough pressure, with enough repetition, even kitchen spoons begin to understand their purpose can be altered, not destroyed, but shifted, not defied, but reimagined. And when placed in the right hands, even a soft instrument can wear through stone. The first one was likely taken in innocence, tucked beneath a robe, not with revolution in mind, but with the simple ache of someone needing to move earth. Perhaps it was grief that drove her. Perhaps it was a name she was not allowed to speak. Perhaps it was the sound of her own heartbeat, echoing too loudly in a convent built for containment. Whatever it was, it brought her to the lowest corner of the convent, where walls met dirt, and where silence had grown too dense to breathe through. There was no ceremony, no moment of decision, only repetition. A spoon into earth, a handful of soil wrapped in cloth and carried to the basin. Another stroke, another handful, a rhythm built not for speed, but for endurance, a pace learned not from scripture, but from longing. She dug not as one fleeing, nor as one defying, but as one remembering what it means to shape space with one's own body. You learned of it not from records. There were no records. No pen ever traced her name beside the act. What survives are gestures, inherited through posture and hesitation, the way Sister Noemi's hands linger too long near the floor during cleaning, the way an older novice once warned you to never leave spoons near the southern stairwell, the way Sister Clemence hums only one note, while washing dishes always the same, always in rhythm with the scrape of metal against basin. You began to collect these gestures, not deliberately at first, but as one might collect seeds blown into the folds of a shawl. You noticed which drawers stuck too tightly, which pots bore scratches too deep for cooking, which aprons seemed to stain only along the knees. You observed that the youngest sisters were never sent to the lower pantries alone, and that the walls there were colder than elsewhere, not with temperature, but with memory. One evening, long after the bells had ceased and the corridors had exhaled their last warmth, you returned to the scullery. You said it was for cloth, and perhaps it was, but your steps were slow, purposeful. You moved not toward the linens, but toward the bin where broken utensils were kept. They weren't discarded. Nothing ever truly was. The convent believed in repair, in repurposing, in the holiness of continued use. You sifted through the heap of warped ladles, cracked handles, tarnished brass, and then you saw it, a wooden spoon, worn down so severely at one edge that it had begun to taper, not to a point, but to the suggestion of one, not sharp, but focused. It was dry, splintered at the rim, darkened by oils that no longer smelled of anything. You lifted it gently, held it in your palm, felt the weight of something that had once served a different purpose, perhaps still did. There was no confession in holding it, no sin, only gravity. You slipped it into your robe. The hidden lives of medieval nuns were not built solely in silence, but in the small inheritances passed without explanation, the way a hand lingers over a wall, the way a hymn pauses between verses, the way one can listen, not for the sound, but for the breath that precedes it. And in that silence, tools became sacred not through consecration, but through usage, through the quiet transformation of object into ritual. You did not dig that night. You weren't ready, but you sat with the spoon in your lap, fingers curled around its worn edge, and you asked it not aloud, but in the soft way memory asks questions, how long it had been since it had last tasted earth. And in return, it said nothing, because it was waiting. because it remembered, because it did not need to speak in order to be understood. It was weeks before you returned to the lower pantry, and when you did, it was not to dig, not exactly, but to listen. The floor there was uneven, its tiles oddly mismatched, and in one corner, beneath the shelf where the salt was kept, the grout ran thinner than the rest. You knelt there, ostensibly to clean, and let your hand rest flat against the stone. It hummed, not with sound, not even with movement, but with presence. You removed the spoon from your sleeve and laid it gently across the floor, pressing its edge to the seam. The wood fit perfectly against the groove, as if the two had once been shaped together. You applied only the faintest pressure, and even that felt like returning something to its original purpose. You didn't continue, you didn't dig. You simply placed it back inside your robe, rose, and walked away. Because some doors are not opened by force. They are opened by recognition, by repetition, by faith. If you've started slipping out of it, keep going. The past barely noticed you were here. A month later, you discovered another. Not a spoon, a mark. Scratched beneath the edge of the second basin in the scullery, a curve. Shallow, imperfect. Etched so lightly it had been overlooked for years. It matched the shape of the tunnel drawn on the parchment found months ago, near the broken psalter. You traced it with your fingernail, and behind you, the wind passed beneath the doorframe in a hush so soft it resembled breath. You did not speak of it. You have stopped speaking of many things, but you remember them all, because this is how the tunnels are kept alive, not through maps, not through speech, but through motion. Through the passing of a spoon from one drawer to another, through the ache in knees bruised by stone, through the careful pause before lifting a tile that does not sit flush with the floor. The tunnel was never about escape. It was about the need to carve one's shape into the world, even if that shape had to disappear beneath the very ground others swore was holy. The hidden lives of medieval nuns are not buried. They are embedded. And sometimes, if you are still enough, if you carry the spoon long enough, if you press your hand to the right seam of stone, you will hear them whisper, not from fear, but from recognition, because they know you now, because they were always waiting. The bed was still warm. That's what they whispered first, not out of shock, but with a kind of cautious reverence, the way one speaks of candles that go out without wind, or of bells that stop mid-swing. Her cot in the Novice dormitory bore no crease of distress, no sign of hurried departure. The sheet was smoothed as it always had been, the blanket folded back neatly. A clay water cup still sat by the stone niche, half full. One slipper was slightly out of line, that was all. She had risen early, they thought, perhaps to pray, perhaps to fetch water, perhaps to seek counsel from the abbess before the bell summoned the others. Her robe was gone from its hook, but her veil remained folded at the foot of her bedding. That detail lingered the longest. Veils did not stay behind. A nun's veil was the last thing she removed, the final layer of separation from the world. To leave it behind was not an accident. No one said it aloud at first. They kept moving, fetching, sweeping, copying scripture, tending to herbs as if motion itself could slow the truth from settling. But by Compline, when the shadows in the cloister had grown long and solemn, and the bell tolled with a hollow finality, they began to realize she would not return. Her name was not spoken the next day, nor the one after, as if saying it might open some invisible door and draw others through it. The abbess remained silent. The sub-prioress kept her keys tighter than usual, and though no orders were given, an unspoken rule rippled through the dormitory, like smoke: do not ask where she went. But you asked anyway, not with your lips, but with your presence. You lingered in the spaces she once occupied, the bench where she embroidered beside the western window, the corner of the orchard where she once plucked lavender and sang half-remembered songs from childhood, the third rung of the pantry ladder, where she paused each time before reaching the top shelf, as though fearing the height even as she climbed. You retraced her steps, not because you expected to find her, but because you needed to understand how absence could take shape, how it could stretch into the walls and lay itself beneath the floor without leaving a trace. You began to notice that others were watching you do this, not accusingly, not with suspicion, but with something gentler, perhaps even with understanding, as if they too had followed similar paths before. She had been quiet, yes, but not invisible. Her laughter had been rare but rich, and her silences thoughtful rather than hollow. She'd once said that the prayers written in the margins of psalters were more honest than the ones sung aloud, that the earth understood intentions better than men did, that sometimes obedience was just well-practiced fear. You remembered that now. You remembered it when you knelt by the hearth in the old scullery, brushing ash aside to reveal a patch of floor, discolored not by soot, but by dampness. You remembered it again when you passed through the north stairwell and saw, faintly etched into the second step, a shape that resembled a simple labyrinth, 3 spirals, joined at the edge, pointing nowhere. The same symbol she had once traced absent-mindedly onto her palm during a sermon on devotion. They had shared stories, in hushed tones, of women who left for pilgrimage and never returned, of those who were sent to other convents in disgrace, never named again, of saints who disappeared into caves and re-emerged only in legend. But this was not that. This was not escape in the traditional sense. It felt older, more deliberate, more quiet. The hidden lives of medieval nuns were rarely heroic in the ways later storytellers imagined. Their rebellions did not roar, they whispered. They unfolded not in fire or martyrdom, but in small absences in the veil left behind, in the spoon no longer in the drawer, in the silence that deepens instead of echoes. You asked yourself what it meant to disappear in a place already defined by erasure, what it meant to be forgotten within a community designed to forget the self. And you wondered whether she had planned it, whether each of her final days had been a ritual of departure, or whether it happened all at once, a sudden knowing, a compulsion drawn from below. One evening, after Vespers, you slipped out of the dormitory and wandered back to the pantry, not with intent, but with instinct. You opened the lowest cupboard, the one that always resisted, and beneath the shelf of dried beans and pickled roots, you noticed a patch of brick where one tile did not match the others. You pressed it lightly. It gave slightly under your hand. You did not lift it, not yet. Instead, you sat there, in the dry dark, with the faint scent of thyme and vinegar around you, and allowed the weight of your breath to fill the room. You imagined her sitting in that same position weeks before, her palms likely scraped, her knees aching against the stone. You imagined her listening not for danger, but for permission, listening for the moment when silence would shift and say, "Go." No one found her. No one searched for her with conviction. Some may have guessed, yes, older sisters with long memories and quiet eyes. But convents were places of ritual, not pursuit. Questions were folded beneath prayers, and prayers, when unanswered, were considered complete in themselves. You learned, in time, to mirror this, to shape your curiosity into softer forms, to press your inquiries into acts of service, into the way you stirred broth or swept the chapel. But at night, when your hands were free and your mind was too quiet for sleep, you began to write. Not letters, those would be confiscated. Not confessionals, those would be read. Just fragments, descriptions, a record of sorts. written on scraps of cloth, tucked into your shoes, stitched into hymns, words not meant to be read, but to remain, to persist. You wrote of her presence, her absence, the small things she left behind that others didn't notice, the way the light caught her profile during evening psalms, the way she paused before kneeling, as if negotiating with the ground, the way she once said, "I believe God gave us hands not only to pray, but to shape the space around us." Perhaps she did not mean to inspire you, but she had, and that was dangerous, because inspiration, in a place meant for repetition, is a kind of resistance. One morning, as the bells called for lauds, you lingered in the refectory instead. The room was mostly empty. A single candle remained lit from the night before. Its wax pooled and hardened into delicate ripples. You stared at it, wondering how something so simple could burn for hours and still hold the shape of its last breath. You picked up the stub and turned it in your palm, then looked toward the window. It was raining, a soft, patient rain. You stood. You walked to the storeroom. You pressed the brick again. This time, you lifted it. Beneath was a cavity not deep, not wide, just a hollow in the stone, large enough for a hand and a thought. And within it, wrapped in thin cloth, was a second veil. Not the one she had left on the cot. Another, older, threadbare, as if it had been passed down, or abandoned long ago. Tucked beside it, a small shard of glazed pottery blue, chipped, familiar. The piece matched the broken bowl from the southern pantry, the one that vanished days after she did. You exhaled, and for a moment, the room seemed to respond, the air shifting slightly, as if remembering her shape. You placed the veil back. You did not take it, because it did not belong to you. Not yet, but it waited there, as all things do, for the next hand that would understand it. The woman who never came back had not disappeared. She had become part of the convent itself, stitched into its absences, sealed behind the silences, humming softly between the prayers and the duties. Her presence now moved like dust settling on shoulders, caught in hymns, trailing behind those who walk slowly enough to notice. And one day, when your time comes, when your hands know the rhythm of the earth, when your breath no longer stumbles in the dark, you will place your own veil down, not in defiance, but in continuation. And you too will walk toward the place where her steps began. Not to escape, but to become, to echo, to remain. You begin to notice it in the pages. Not the words themselves, those remain inked in formality, unwavering in their Latin solemnity, but the edges. The parchment where you rest your thumb has darkened, not merely with age, but with something more ancient. Earth, silt, residue from a place no psalm was meant to touch. You press your fingertip to the margin of Psalm 61, and when you lift it, there is a faint grain left behind, something coarse and old and defiantly out of place. The scent follows, not strong, barely there. A breath of damp stone and loam, like soil left too long beneath a sleeping rug, like the ghost of a garden that grew where it should not have. It threads itself through the morning prayers, clings faintly to the sleeves of novices who have never stepped beyond the cloister walls. Even the abbess begins to pause when she flips a page. No one speaks of it. Of course they don't, because to name it is to grant it legitimacy, and to grant it legitimacy is to admit that there is something moving beneath the surface, not only of the Psalter, but of the convent itself, and so they adjust. A few sisters begin to wear gloves when turning pages. Others wipe their hands more frequently after copying scripture. One young scribe folds a handkerchief beneath the lower edge of her palm, as if to protect herself from contamination. You do not. You let the grain gather. The smell awakens memory, somewhere deep and bodily, as if your bones remember mud before your mind remembers language. It pulls you back to moments long buried, digging a garden plot beside your mother, toes blackened with clay, slipping in a rain-wet alley before the convent days, the scent of your father's boots drying near a hearth after weeks away from the city. All of it is stored in the smell of this ancient dust. The earth is not merely beneath your feet. It is inside the Psalms now. And that is what frightens the abbess most, because Scripture is supposed to be clean, elevated, unstained. These pages are sanctified, copied by hands that fasted and prayed, inked with discipline, bound in quiet obedience. To find them compromised not by fire or heresy, but by something earthen and mundane is a different kind of violation. This is not a thief breaking the lock or a soldier storming the gate. It is dirt, and it has come in slow. You catch Sister Agnes brushing soil from the lectern one morning. She is subtle about it, using her sleeve, eyes cast down in pretend prayer. But you see the motion, and more importantly, you see the resignation in it. This is not the first time she has done this. Perhaps not even the 10th. The dirt keeps returning. The Psalms keep absorbing it. The stone beneath the convent, it seems, is breathing again. You return to your favorite passage that night, Psalm 139, the one that says, "If I make my bed in Sheol, you are there." You have always found comfort in that line, though you never quite knew why. Now, as your finger traces the words, you feel the grit settle beneath your nail. It is a quiet baptism, a hallowing by earth instead of water. In the scriptorium, the smell grows bolder. Ink begins to resist the page as if the parchment itself has grown damp. The candles flicker even when the air is still. A few sisters fall ill with headaches, claiming the dust is to blame. Others start to speak of visions, shadows moving where there should be none, whispers where the silence was once pure. You do not see these things, not with your eyes, but you sense the shift. It is not evil, what grows beneath, nor is it holy in the way the convent defines holiness. It is older. It belongs to the hidden lives of medieval nuns, to the bodies that prayed but also wept, to the hands that copied Scripture and also dug earth with stolen spoons. You begin to think that the Psalms themselves are changing, not in text, but in texture, as if each one is slowly becoming a record of the soil. You wonder what happens when every prayer carries the weight of something buried. What happens when faith and dirt become indistinguishable? One evening, you remain in the chapel after everyone else has gone. The candlelight softens the sharp lines of the pews, the air thick with incense that cannot quite mask the smell anymore. You open the oldest book, a crumbling volume said to predate the convent itself, and you find, tucked between the pages, a petal, dry, cracked, still faintly purple. Lavender, it does not belong in this book. No one presses flowers here. No one preserves softness. But someone did, and the soil clinging to its edges is not symbolic. It is literal. The petal came from beneath. Your hands tremble as you close the book. That night, your dreams are earthen. You find yourself walking barefoot through a tunnel not entirely dark, the walls packed tight with damp soil, smooth from the passage of hands. You walk slowly, not from fear, but reverence. You feel the prayers there, not in words, but in residue, in echo, in scent. And when you wake, your nails are dirty. You do not wash them. At breakfast, you watch others glance towards their books with suspicion. A few sisters cough. One complains of mildew. The abbess announces that a mason will be brought to inspect the stone for cracks. But you know there is no crack, only breath. The earth is exhaling. In the days that follow, The psalms begin to sing differently. Not louder, not more beautifully, but lower, deeper, as if the harmonies are no longer pitched for heaven, but for the places beneath. The choir does not comment, but they shift their tone. You hear it in their throats, the gravity of soil pressed into sound. Sister Beatrix begins to hum in strange keys. Sister Ruth refuses to sit near the eastern wall. A novice, only just received, asks why the chapel always smells like rain. No one answers her. And then one day, someone writes a new psalm. Not aloud, not officially, but scratched into the wooden underside of a kneeler. You find it while cleaning. 6 lines, no signature, written in vernacular French, not Latin. And the last line reads, "The dirt remembers every step we tried to forget." You look up. No one else sees you reading. No one asks. But in that moment, you feel as though the entire convent is holding its breath. You copy the words into your own margin, beside Psalm 40, not to preserve them, but to let them join the others. The ink seeps more slowly now. The page feels heavier, but it accepts the line. The earth beneath your prayers is not silent. It is waiting. It begins not with fear, but with familiarity. A whisper in the corner of your vision. A scuttle too soft for anyone else to notice. You have lived long enough behind stone to know what sounds belong to the convent. The scraping of sandals on cold tile. The distant rustle of pages. The wet cough of Sister Elsbeth in the early hours. The dull knock of bowls in the refectory. This is not one of them. It is older, more intimate, as if the walls themselves are remembering something. You catch it one evening, kneeling by the back altar after Compline. Everyone else has gone. The chapel is dark, save for a few votive candles still licking at their wicks. The scent of wax and dust is thick in your nostrils when you hear it. A small sound, not disruptive, not threatening, but purposeful. Soft claws against worn stone. You turn, and you see it. A rat, no larger than your palm. Its coat is a dull brown, speckled with ash and shadow. It pauses at the edge of the choir stall, nose twitching, ears alert. It does not run. It does not fear you. In fact, it stares, as if it has been waiting. You do not move. Neither does it. The moment hangs, delicate as thread. Then it turns, darts across the stone floor, past the crumbling corner of the sacristy wall, and vanishes into a small crevice where the floor meets the base of the eastern nave. A place you've passed 100 times and never truly seen. A place too small for memory, but just wide enough for truth. The rat disappears into that space, and you are left kneeling, heart slow, breath held, unsure whether you have witnessed something sacred or profane. The next morning, you check the corner. No one else is in the chapel yet. The light is gray, reluctant, seeping through leaded glass. You run your fingers along the seam where the stone meets the base. It is real. The mortar has crumbled just enough. There's a passage, not made by human hands, at least not recently, but worn, smoothed, as though something or someone has moved through it many times. You return again the following evening. The same time, the same silence. This time you carry a candle stub, cupped in your palm. You wait, and it returns. The rat emerges soundlessly from behind the hymn shelf. It moves without hesitation, without panic. It pauses again, halfway to the crevice, looks at you, and then vanishes once more into the wall. It is invitation. You don't follow, not yet, but something inside you does. That night, you lie in your cot and dream of burrows, of roots tangled in stone, of warmth beneath soil, of movement that does not disturb but remembers. You wake with the feeling of dirt beneath your nails. There is none, but your hands still ache with the memory. You tell no one, not Sister Beatrix, who watches you more than she admits, not the abbess, who has grown wary of dreams. You hold it close, the way one might hold a psalm too honest to share aloud. On the third night, you bring a lantern. You slip from your cot during the hour when even the ghosts of prayers have fallen still. You do not knock anything over. You know the hallways too well. You reach the chapel without sound, without disruption, like a thought not yet formed. The rat is already waiting. It stands at the crevice, its body half turned. When you raise the lantern, it blinks once and enters. You follow. It's tight. The opening forces you to crouch, then crawl. You grip the lantern in one hand, dragging it forward inch by inch. The tunnel smells of earth, not fresh garden soil, but the old kind. The kind found beneath cellars, behind forgotten brick. It is dry in some places, damp in others. You feel the change with your palms, in the way the air thickens around your breath. You should be afraid, but you are not. The tunnel doesn't wind sharply. It curves gently, as if someone dug it slowly over time, listening as they moved. The walls are uneven, scratched in some places, packed smooth in others. You imagine fingers pressing dirt, carving silence. The rat is always just ahead, visible for a moment, then gone, then back again. It never looks back. It never has to. You are already committed. You crawl for what feels like hours, but must be less. The weight of the world above becomes heavier, not physically, but in meaning. The convent is still there, its prayers, its order, its bells, but you are not beneath it anymore. You are somewhere else, somewhere built from a different kind of vow. Then the tunnel opens, a small chamber. Not a room, a space. Round, imperfect, barely high enough to kneel in. The earth here has been shaped, reinforced with fragments, wooden boards, bits of stone, what looks like a broken handle of a spoon, objects repurposed, not for escape, but for something else. You raise the lantern. There, in the center, lie 5 veils, not folded, not discarded, placed, arranged with care. Each one bears a faint mark, a stitch, a smear, a tear. You recognize them. Sister Magdalene, gone 3 winters ago. Sister Lenore, who vanished in spring and was said to have drowned. The rest, unnamed but known. Your breath catches. The rat moves across the pile, not to disturb, but to trace. You kneel, lantern held before you. The chamber feels warm, not from the flame, but from presence. You feel it in your knees, in your ribs, in the back of your neck. Someone prayed here, not with words, with their hands, with their decisions. You do not reach for a veil, not yet. Instead, you listen, not for voices, for silence. And in that silence, you begin to understand. This was not a place of hiding. It was a place of becoming. A place where rules unraveled, not in rebellion, but in need. The veil did not mean the same thing down here. It was not surrender. It was story. You sit. The rat is gone. It did not leave. It faded, like a final breath. You stay until your knees ache and your lantern gutters. Then you rise. You take one veil, the last one, the one left nearest the edge. You crawl back the way you came. When you emerge, the chapel is still dark. No one has stirred. You return to your cot. Fold the veil beneath your pillow. And you sleep. That morning, you wake with soil on your fingers. You do not wash them. The rat does not return. It does not need to. The way is open now. The rest is yours to choose. It begins with a hum, faint, uncertain, a sound with no clear origin. Not melody, not hymn, just a tremble of air that makes the torchlight flicker and your breath pause in your chest. You're returning to the tunnel now, not every night, but enough that the dust has stopped noticing you. Enough that the space between walls no longer closes in, but folds around you like fabric softened with use. There is no fear, not anymore. Only a question, wide as the dark, waiting to be asked slowly. The tunnel curves deeper now. You'd thought you had reached the end, the chamber where the veils rested like forgotten oaths. But on your 7th visit, you find that the rat's path had not ended merely turned. A crumbled patch of earth, long hidden behind fallen stones, yields to your touch. Not resistance, just permission. You follow, and there beneath layers of stillness, behind walls that remember the pressure of fingers, and the silence of vows is the sound. A tone, low and even, threading through the corridor like smoke. It does not come from above. It does not echo from the convent. It is born of the earth, or perhaps the one who sat inside it long enough to teach it to sing. You crawl slower now, not from weariness, but reverence. The soil feels warmer. You don't ask how or why. You only notice the change, a softer scent, the way your lantern casts fewer shadows, the presence of carved marks on the sidewalls. Not words, not quite. Lines, spirals, symbols meant more for memory than for eyes. Then, a chamber, smaller than the last, rounder, shaped by careful hands. And there she is. She doesn't look up as you enter. Her head is bowed, veil limp against the nape of her neck, robes grayed by dust. Her lips are parted. The sound you heard, the hum, is hers. It vibrates in her chest, low and continuous, like the purring of something ancient. Her hands rest in her lap, palms turned upward, fingers twitching slightly as though still listening for a note not yet reached. You do not speak. You do not dare. The space around her is not empty, it is full of sound, of stillness, of a presence that does not announce itself, yet fills the lungs more fully than breath. She opens her eyes slowly. They meet yours, and in them, you see neither surprise nor welcome, only recognition, as if she has been waiting, not for you, but for the moment in which you would finally arrive. She lifts one hand, her index finger extends, not to point, but to press against her lips. Not silence, stillness, a difference. You nod, and she resumes. Her hum deepens. It flows along the tunnel walls, making them seem less like barriers and more like a throat through which the entire world is preparing to speak. The marks on the walls catch the light now, casting shadows that dance in rhythm with the tones. You are not just hearing the sound, you are inside it. You close your eyes, and then you see, not with vision, with memory that is not your own, a girl, younger than you, pressing her ear to the stone wall as the others chant above. Her song does not match theirs. It slips between their lines. Beneath the psalms, a counterpoint, a defiance made of harmony, a punishment. The silence that followed was not imposed, it was chosen. She stopped speaking aloud so she could hear the song more clearly. She dug, not alone. Others followed. But she was the first to hum while she worked, the first to turn a tunnel into an instrument. The others lit candles. She lit resonance. You open your eyes. She has not moved. Yet you feel she has shared more with you than words ever could. A part of her song now lingers in your chest, a thread, tied gently to your ribs. You imagine tugging it and hearing her respond, from wherever she goes when she is not here. You whisper, softly, a single note. Her lips curve, not a smile, an acknowledgement. You stay with her for hours, maybe days. You do not count. You breathe when she breathes. You hum when she hums. You learn that songs can be made without voice, that silence can carry a melody when held long enough. Eventually, you ask not with words, but with presence why she stays. She does not answer, but the earth does. It shivers gently, just once, a breath beneath your knees. And you know, she is not trapped. She is not lost. She is keeping something alive. Some sound the world forgot how to hear, a sound that only survives underground, in the air between vows and dirt, between discipline and longing. You rise. When she finally closes her eyes, she does not sleep. She simply folds herself into the tone. You leave the chamber, and as you crawl back toward the world that still expects prayers to follow form, you realize you have forgotten how to walk without rhythm. Your steps carry a hum now, subtle but persistent. A week later, during Vespers, Sister Beatrix pauses mid-hymn. She glances toward the choir stall, toward you. Her eyes narrow, and then almost imperceptibly she matches your note. You blink. You are no longer the only one humming underground. You should not be returning this soon. The soil still clings beneath your fingernails, and the dust of that chamber where humming became prayer has yet to lift from your robe's hem. But the weight in your chest, subtle and humming like the echo of a held note, pulls you downward again before the bell for prime has even finished its final chime. Something below is incomplete, not lost, not broken, but waiting. You wait until the corridor quiets, until Sister Beatrix no longer glances your way with that flicker of knowing, until the candles have burned low enough to let the convent's edges blur into shadow. Then, you slip through the passage behind the bread room, your steps soft, your heart louder than your footfalls. The tunnel accepts you like an old rhythm. You know each bend now, not in numbers but in feel, the spot where the air grows warmer, where the earth tightens near your shoulders, where the carved spiral marks sing back when touched. You descend without fear, only a quiet urgency, like someone remembering the second half of a sentence long forgotten. You do not return to the sister who sang. That space feels closed now, like a page turned carefully and not to be reopened. Instead, your hand drifts along the wall, past the fork, toward the slope you hadn't noticed before, one that curves not deeper, but sideways. A branch path, perhaps a mistake in the digging, perhaps a secret in its own right. The air is denser here, and with it comes a scent not of soil, but of cloth aged, fibrous, faintly sweet like dried lavender caught in old linen. You follow the scent, the tunnel narrows, and your body folds with it. Knees bend, back rounds, hands reach forward instinctively before your eyes catch what they've already sensed. A shred of fabric soft, once pale, now tinged with the earthy gray of years spent in the dark. It clings to the edge of a rough stone corner, as though trying to pass through and failing. You touch it. It resists, not in defiance, but in memory. It is a veil, torn, not cut. The fabric has frayed in a way that only stone can cause. Threads stretch like tendons, curled and tensed, as if the one who wore it did not stop when it caught, as if she kept going, regardless of what it cost her. You crouch beside the veil and look ahead. The tunnel does not open wider, it shrinks. The walls draw together into a narrow squeeze, just wide enough for a body that does not hesitate, just high enough for a back that knows how to bend without resistance. You hesitate, not out of fear, out of reverence. She went through here. Whoever she was, she chose to press forward after her garment tore. She did not turn back. That, more than the veil itself, is what holds your gaze. You breathe in once, then follow. The stones do not yield. They scrape and pull. Your shoulders protest, and your knees bruise against uneven patches of forgotten work. But you continue, because now you are no longer alone. You feel her presence not as a ghost, not as a memory, but as momentum, as a force pulling forward, invisible and deliberate. Then suddenly, space. The tunnel widens into a hollow cavity round, unfinished, like a breath held too long. A pocket carved not for prayer, not for storage, but for stopping, resting, or hiding. You scan the chamber. It is smaller than the others, but something here feels vast. In the center lies a small pile of objects, carefully arranged a wooden comb, a dried apple core shriveled with age, 2 wax stubs of candles, and a leather strap, cracked but still buckled. Around them, the floor bears impressions of knees, many knees, worn patches where cloth met stone over and over again. And beside this circle, partially embedded in the wall, another veil. This one is not torn. It is pinned in place by a stone, a large one, pushed hard against the fabric's edge. There is no blood, but there is finality. You reach out and touch it. The cloth is brittle, yet it does not fall apart. Your fingers slide along its surface and find embroidery, faint, faded, but present. 3 tiny crosses stitched into one corner. Not a nun's mark, a mother's, the kind given at birth, woven into the christening veil, meant to protect and name and bless. She came down here not as a sister. She came as a daughter. You sit down slowly, unsure if your knees tremble from exertion or realization. This was no escape tunnel. Not entirely. It was a return to something earlier, something deeper than vows and candles, a place not to flee, but to become. You imagine her, whoever she was, kneeling here night after night, far from the rigid gaze of the abbess, away from the sharp whispers of the cloister. Perhaps she wept. Perhaps she simply breathed. Perhaps she unpinned her veil each time and rested it upon the stone beside her, watching it become more frayed, more hers. And maybe, one night, she decided not to return. The veil caught on the stone behind her was not lost. It was chosen, left behind like a molted shell, a marker, not of defeat, but of transition. You lean back against the chamber wall and close your eyes. And for a moment, you feel it. Not a hum this time, not a sound at all. A presence, a pressure, like someone else exhaling beside you. Not beside you in space, but in time, as if her breath remains here, layered like sediment, pressing gently into the shape of whoever sits long enough to receive it. You do not cry. There is nothing tragic in this place, only something beautifully unfinished. A path that narrows to a point and then opens not upward, but inward. This was not a passage to escape the convent. It was a passage to find what the convent could never name. When you finally rise, the veil is still caught, still whispering. You leave it there, but before you crawl back through the narrow bend, you add something to the small circle of objects, a ribbon from your own robe, just a sliver, torn carefully, placed beside the comb and the wax and the apple stem, a quiet acknowledgement that she was not forgotten, that the thread continues, that someone came back. You return slower this time. It's not hesitation, it's reverence, a kind of stillness that wraps itself around your limbs the deeper you descend. By now, the tunnel no longer feels like stone and soil. It feels like memory not yours, but shared, stretching long and uninterrupted beneath the feet of every sister who ever dared to press her ear to the ground and listen for the way out. But you're not searching for the way out anymore. You've passed the place where the humming lived. You've touched the veil snagged on ancient stone. You've sat in silence with the space that knew more than the chapel above ever dared to sing. And still, there is one thing left: the last candle. You've heard whispers of it not from the sisters, but from the shape of the air itself, as if it waited for someone willing to walk slowly enough to notice the shift in light. You carry a lantern, though you don't need it. Your eyes have grown wise in the dark, but something in you insists on bringing flame. You've lit too many in your time above ground at altars, in mourning, in celebration. But this is different. This is not for ritual. This is for completion. The path slopes in ways it didn't before, or maybe you simply never noticed. It pulls downward, yes, but also inward, like a thread pulling through layers of fabric, tighter and tighter until the last stitch is sealed. You descend through silence, but it is not empty. You pass the grooves carved by spoon or fingernail or will alone. You pause by the chamber where the veil still rests like a second skin. You offer a glance, no words, and move on. Eventually, the tunnel narrows until it can only be called a passage, no longer built for movement, but for decision. You crouch, then crawl. The air grows colder, not from lack of heat, but from the presence of something that resists time itself. Stone walls squeeze tighter, and for a moment, you wonder if this was ever meant to be walked at all. And then the space opens. You rise slowly. Before you is an arch, not grand, not carved with majesty or adorned in frescoes. It is simple, unfinished, as though it was dug not for beauty, but for finality. A frame, a threshold, and at its base, a candle. Small, ordinary. The kind lit at vespers, or placed at bedside for reading psalms in the quiet hours before dawn. But this one has never seen the chapel. Its wax is thick with dust, its wick unburnt, and yet something about it feels warm, expectant, waiting. You kneel. You set your lantern beside it and gently draw your flint. The spark is soft, the flame slower to catch than usual, as if the wick itself had been holding its breath for decades, maybe longer. But when it does take light, it glows not like a flame, but like memory, amber, gentle, unshaken. The arch shifts in your vision, not physically, but in weight. It's no longer just the end of a tunnel. It becomes a symbol, a passage. You move closer, slowly, and realize the walls around the arch are smooth. Not scraped, not dug, smoothed by touch. Countless fingers, over countless years, brushing the same stone, the same shape, as if preparing it to remember. You reach out and place your palm upon it. It is warm, not from the candle, from presence, from the memory of those who passed this way, not in fear, but in resolve. No one wrote records of what lay beyond. No parchment in the convent mentions this place. No sister above ever whispered of an arch buried deep beneath the garden roots and choir stalls. And yet every line in your body tells you that they came here. Some walked through, some turned back. Some placed their palm upon the stone and wept, then returned to their cloistered beds without ever uttering a word of it. And some, like you, simply stayed, not to flee, not to rise, but to understand. The candle flickers. Its light casts shadows that form shapes not of faces, but of postures, the curve of a back that has carried silence for too long. the clasped hands of one who dared to hope, the stillness of someone who has lost nothing and yet grieves deeply anyway. The arch does not lead to another tunnel, nor to freedom. It leads to choice. You step forward, past the flame, under the arch. On the other side, the chamber is narrow and clean. No dust, no debris, only stone worn smooth by presence. There is a mat of woven reeds, a bowl with nothing inside, and the faintest echo of breath. You sit. It takes hours before you realize it. There is no exit, not in a fearful sense. There are no traps, no doors, but there is something final in the quiet here, as if the space was not built for movement, but for settling, for resting the kind of weight that cannot be carried back upward. And so you listen for the hum, for the prayer, for the whisper of the sister who sang, or the scuffle of the rat who showed the way, but there is none. Only breath, yours. It is enough. You are not alone. Though no one sits beside you, you know that you are surrounded by echoes of decisions made in silence. The sisters who came before did not need monuments or hymns to be remembered. They needed a chamber where their truth could sit undisturbed, a space where faith was not defined by obedience, but by the courage to follow the echo beneath one's own ribs. You rest your hand upon your chest. There is a beat there, slow, steady, but beneath it a hum, not sound, but vibration, like a memory planted deep in the body, rooted below the ribs, blooming, not upward but inward. You do not try to name it. Naming would only narrow it. Instead, you allow it to widen, to settle in your breath, in your bones, in the dark behind your eyes. You close them, and in the blackness you see light, not from the candle, from her, the one who hummed, from the one who left her veil, from the sisters who brushed these walls and pressed this floor with knees that bore both weight and grace. You join them, not as escape, as remembrance. You do not leave the arch, but neither do you stay. When you finally rise, you carry something back with you, not in your hands, in your posture, in your silence. You walk slowly up the tunnel, past the candle now dimming, past the chamber where the veil still breathes, past the slope where sound once lived. And when you reach the chapel, when the next hymn begins, and Sister Beatrix turns toward you with her knowing glance, you do not smile, you do not speak, you only hum. A single note. It is not defiance. It is witness. It began with a renovation, not a holy one, not a prayerful one, just scaffolding, permits, and the scent of wet plaster clinging to habits as the newer sisters complained about leaks above the apse and cracks in the tiles near the apothecary. No one intended to disturb history. They only wanted a roof that didn't weep in winter, and walls that didn't peel like forgotten psalms. But the past, it seems, has a pulse. It happened just after Michaelmas, during the first heavy rains. A hired mason, not one of faith, just a man with mortar on his knuckles and weather in his bones, removed a stone to assess a deeper fault. The stone gave too easily. It wasn't anchored. It slid free like a memory, revealing not rot, but air, cold, unmoving air that had waited. They called the abbess, she called the heritage board, they called the diocese. No one knew what they'd found, but everyone, it seemed, wanted a say in what they should do next. Eventually, they sent a historian, a woman with soft shoes, quiet eyes, and a way of listening to walls. She stepped down into the dark, past where the tiles ended, past where even rumor dared not follow. She walked slowly, candle in hand, notebook forgotten. What she found did not fit into footnotes. The tunnel was real, not a sewer, not a catacomb, not a collapse. It was carved with care, with reverence, and it led to places the blueprints of the convent never dreamed existed. The historian emerged, shaken but silent. Her report was brief. There is a truth buried here. It is older than disobedience and deeper than penance. The diocese stalled. The abbess prayed. The workers paused. But the earth she continued to open, stone by stone. They revealed the path. It wasn't easy. Parts of it had caved. Other parts had been filled deliberately, as if someone, at some point, had tried to bury not just the tunnel, but the decision behind it. Still, the passage survived, curved and narrow. It breathed with every footfall. It held the dust of centuries. Yes, but more than that, it held the weight of choices made in silence. It smelled of earth, of lavender long since faded, of wax, of time. They found the arch next. The stone had worn smooth beneath human hands. No inscriptions, no icons, just presence. A portal made not to awe, but to remember. And there, near its base, they found the candle, long extinguished, but its wick still bore the ghost of fire. And beside it a veil, brittle with age, not draped, not discarded, placed, as if folded by hands that understood ritual and yet chose something quieter. The historian returned, this time with gloves, this time with reverence. She did not document the chamber beyond, not in maps, not in sketches, only in breath. There are no remains, she whispered when asked, but there is presence. Some wanted to restore it, open it to the public, make it an exhibit, the hidden faith of forgotten nuns. Others objected, too sacred, too uncertain. The abbess said nothing. She only visited the site each morning before matins, lighting a new candle each day and placing it just before the arch. She never stepped beyond it. But some did. A sister young, but not naive, once entered the chamber and stayed for hours. When she returned, she said nothing, but her silence changed. It deepened, became the kind of silence that sang. And then others followed. One by one, they visited. None stayed, not like the ones before, but something passed between the old and the new, a breath, a memory, a hum. Eventually, the diocese relented. They walled the chamber again, not to hide it, but to honor it. A simple plaque was placed nearby. It did not name names. It did not claim discovery. It read, "To those who crawled beneath faith, seeking something wider than obedience." And so, the earth settled. But it never truly closed, because even now, in the newer halls of the convent, sometimes the walls hum when no wind stirs. Sometimes a candle flickers when no one is near. Sometimes a novice, lost in thought, will kneel at the wrong chapel and feel a warmth rise through the stone. And somewhere deep in the dark beneath it all, a veil still rests on cool stone, waiting, not to be found, but to be remembered. So now you've heard the hum beneath the chapel, the veils that whispered more than they covered, the breath that lingered in tunnels where names were never spoken aloud. Maybe tonight, you imagined the stone beneath your hands. Maybe you walked a little slower down a hallway you once passed without thought. Or maybe you simply listened. Listen to the way silence shifts when it carries memory. Listen to the breath of those who never asked permission to leave only forgiveness after. Listen to yourself. History, after all, is not only written by those who ruled. Sometimes, it's stitched into the hollow of a hymn that didn't rhyme, into a prayer that ended with dirt under the fingernails, into a room no one dared mark on the convent map, but someone, many someones remembered with their footsteps. Not every vow was broken. Some were simply rewritten, beneath candlelight, one stone at a time, not out of defiance, but hope. Let the tunnels close behind your thoughts. Let the candle burn low. Let the veils rest. And if this story kept you company, consider liking the video or subscribing to the channel. It helps more than you think and lets us keep wandering down these forgotten paths together. Let me know in the comments. Where are you listening from tonight? And did you feel that moment when silence turned into song? You don't have to remember everything, but maybe you'll remember this. You've walked far enough tonight. Let the floorboards hold the rest. And if you're still awake, was it a little easier this time? This has been Boring History Nights. Sleep well.